The only rule that we start the game with is simply this. The morning sessions will assume one factor and one factor alone. The British government have heard that the Germans and others are open to a broad renegotiation, that as an option is acceptable to them. So the next question, and I'll turn it over to Andrea in a minute, will be, what is it that you want? Okay, which is the question that will matter. And then we'll turn it over to hopefully Ulrich. What is it that you're prepared to accept and negotiate on, and what is it that you're not?
So global competitiveness is the first agenda item, I think, that is on the table as far as Britain is concerned in looking at a renegotiation. What more can we do to ensure that we can build a successful European Union that enables us to compete in a global world where, frankly, the emerging markets are going to be eating our breakfast, lunch and dinner if we don't get our skates on. So that's the first very important area for negotiation. The second one, however, is that of reform and flexibility. And this is where, as all of you will know from your own opinion polls in your own countries, there is a big concern about the way that the EU has overregulated and overburdened small businesses and, to a certain extent, big business. And there are many regulations around social and employment law which are no longer relevant. One of those particular areas is the Working Time Directive. For many member states, it's one of the least attractive pieces of EU legislation ever proposed, and as something that should be on the table to look at again. Potential to repatriate social and employment law, not to try and do down workers' rights, but to focus on the need for particularly young people to be able to get jobs, to be able, even on a short-term contract, even without the sort of marvellous social contracts of some of European member states, but it should be for member states to determine the terms for employment. We across the EU have a massive problem, particularly with youth unemployment, that has to be solved. Other areas for reform that we want to see in the structural funds. Here's an area where we are recycling money amongst wealthier EU member states. Issues like that, reforming structural funds, reforming CAP, reforming fisheries, so that we lose some of the ridiculous results that we have, whereby we're unfairly subsidising certain activities and we are not really promoting competition and competing on a global scale. We need to change some of those things in the area of reform. So reform and flexibility is absolutely key. And then the third area I want to talk about is that of democratic accountability. And it's true to say that right across the EU, the democratic legitimacy is now wafer thin. In turnouts for European elections, we've seen dramatically low turnouts. European voters are simply not engaging with the European Union, either because of our systems of voting for MEPs, or because of disaffection with the EU, or indeed possibly because people don't really understand the EU. But we do have to, if we're to make the EU successful, do something very sincerely different to enhance the democratic legitimacy. And there, what Britain believes we have to create is a means to change European legislation. It cannot be the case that we stick to the ever closer union, the acquis communautaire, and the one-way travel for legislation. There has to be a means to turn that around and to reverse legislation previously agreed, and also for member states who wish to do so to prevent legislation from reaching the books. A perfect example of that was the European Public Prosecutor's Office very recently, where a number of member states showed a yellow card saying that they didn't believe we needed a European Public Prosecutor's Office, but the Commission just disregarded it. That cannot be allowed to happen if we want true democratic legitimacy. But it's not only about new legislation, it's also about existing legislation. If we want the EU to succeed, we need a permanent means by which we can change agreements that have already been made. So, and what I'm proposing on behalf of Britain is a red card process, whereby instead of a yellow card, member states have a red card that they can show that will not only block new legislative ideas, but will also reverse existing legislative ideas. So a group of member states can stop a previously agreed piece of legislation. Obviously, those who want to go ahead under enhanced cooperation can do so. But that, to me, speaking for Britain, is a red line area. There must be the means to achieve that renegotiation. So that's my three areas: global competitiveness, flexibility and reform, and democratic accountability. And the key question for all of you, to begin with, is of course the one of treaty change. I have a number of proposals that would require treaty change and a number that wouldn't. And so my first question to all of you is, what is your appetite for treaty change? Do you see it as inevitable that there must be treaty change in order to achieve European banking union and the success of the European currency? Or do you believe that treaty change is would be a red line area for your national negotiating position? Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. I represent France today, so I should speak in French. I would hate to speak in English, but for the sake of the debate, I'll speak in English this morning. So first of all, I mean, this is not often said, but France wants to keep the UK in. It's true, but there are things that we won't accept. The first thing is that we want a coherent and strong Europe. I think pretty much like Britain, where solidarity is at the core of what we do. Also, and this is fundamental for us, we want a stronger and more a stronger economic and monetary union. More integrated because we depend on each other. We have a common currency, and as the current crisis has shown, it has weaknesses that we have to fix. We don't feel that the national parliament should have a red card. What is already on the table, the yellow card, is good enough for us, and we need to use it more so that it's clearer for the European Commission that they can't just disregard the role of national parliaments, but the red card is too strong for us. We will not go there. And as far as treaty change is concerned, is it inevitable? It is not. It is certainly not. There's one thing that we don't want is, as we say in French, to détricoter, so to unwind, as my German colleague mentioned earlier, to unwind the acquis communautaire. So if the idea is to unwind the existing legislations, we will not go that way. And for the banking union, frankly, we can do a lot of things within the treaties. And if we don't, if we need a new treaty, maybe we don't need to open the treaties. Maybe we can do a new TSCG. This might be the way to go, an intergovernmental treaty, because for us it's very difficult to, as history has shown, it's very difficult for us to pass a referendum in France. So treaty change, not for now, really not. Thank you.
And John, what's the view in Brussels?
I think it's also very important that in approaching a negotiation like this, Britain asks itself the question: does it want the European Union to continue, whether it's in it or not, as a workable entity that has the capacity of making decisions reasonably efficiently? Or does it want the European Union essentially to wither away, not to disappear, but to wither away in terms of its effectiveness? The risk, for example, of introducing red cards is that it effectively creates yet another obstacle to an already complex process of the EU legislation, a fifth or sixth hurdle that have to be crossed. And that will mean that the EU essentially will not be capable of dealing legislatively with challenges that it needs to deal with quickly, and that will essentially undermine the European Union. And I think that Britain needs to consider what its goals are here. If Britain's goals are to ultimately, weaken the European Union, then I think if that is perceived by your negotiating partners, you essentially will get nothing. If, on the other hand, Britain is seen to be wanting to strengthen the European Union but make it more effective, then almost anything that you put forward that's reasonable is possible to be contemplated. But I think one of the first question we will be asking ourselves in the European Parliament and the European Commission is, what's Britain's long-term game here? I think we've also got to contemplate the process that we will be using here. in this phase of the negotiation, that is before lunch, we'll be using Article 48 of the treaty, which allows an individual country to request treaty changes. To have that processed, it has to obtain a simple majority in the Council. Therefore, you need to be very careful in what measures you put forward. If you put forward proposals that a significant blocking minority finds wholly objectionable, you will not get the agreement under Article 48 to even start the negotiation. If you do get to start the negotiation, that it will then go into a convention where every country will have a vote and which will operate by consensus. And as we know, certain changes that the vast majority of people in the last convention would want to have happened didn't happen because the United Kingdom wouldn't allow them to happen. Well, in this case, Malta could decide that it's not going to allow something that you want to happen because it doesn't suit them. So you could have, or Ireland, or France, or any one country, because the convention operates by consensus, would have the capacity to block what you're looking for. So you need to think very carefully how you'd overcome that hurdle. And then finally, in the event that you do get treaty change agreed in this convention, you'd have to have the consent of all of the member parliaments to that treaty change. Some may decide they have to have a referendum on it. And you could envisage, a referendum in France, which will not be controlled necessarily by the French government. In fact, usually people vote against their governments in French referenda. You could see what you're being submitted, what has been agreed to by the French government, being rejected by the French people, or the Irish people, or whoever else decides to have a plebiscite. Finally, I think we've got to look at the question of representative democracy. What is Britain prepared to do to make the European Union more democratic at a European level? Would you, for instance, be willing to accept the direct election by the people of Europe of the President of the Commission? That would certainly create, for the first time, a European space for democratic dialogue. It would create a demos. Would you be prepared to accept that some of the seats in the European Parliament would be elected in a pan-European election? Perhaps 10% of the seats would be elected off a European list, where people could make a European choice. Would you be prepared to accept those things? Because there's not much point complaining about Europe not being democratic enough if you're not willing to contemplate things being done that would make it more democratic.
Thank you, John. Lucio, over to you, playing both Italy and Spain in 5 minutes, so that's not a challenge of any kind.
Okay. Well, the first thing I notice when I discuss Europe with my European friends and partners is that it seems that time doesn't matter. It seems that we have all the time. We have not all the time. I come from a historically very much pro-European country, which is turning Eurosceptic, I would say to some extent even Europhobic. Look at the figures. The degree of Euro-pessimism in Italy is 51%. In Britain is 52%. So we are almost at the same level, which means that the issues which are discussing here are not exactly about economics, about flexibility, about the regulation. Of course, it is also about that, but it is essentially a political issue, namely what kind of Europe we want or we don't want. And to be very clear about the British approach, we are not interested in renegotiating the British membership in Europe. We are not interested because, first of all, as you said, John, I think that one Europe and one European regulation in general is better than 28. And I think that opening a chapter of renegotiating the British membership means that we will reopen many other chapters. Many other partners will ask for specific treatments, and which is absolutely legitimate, but which is not in our interests. I think that we may renegotiate any kind of relation to the UK and to not European zone members only if we manage to build some kind of European confederation in the Eurozone. This is our vision of the euro, which means reversing the trend, because what we actually had in the last couple of years was the euro acting as a disintegrating factor in Europe, not as an integrating one, which is a very serious problem, especially for the southern countries, which means especially for Italy and Spain and others. One problem we have in negotiating with the Brits about Europe is that we are afraid about the possibility that renegotiating is only the first step towards breaking up of Europe, towards Brexit. And Brexit, as we will maybe see afterwards, is not about Europe and Britain, it's about the disintegration or not disintegration of Europe. And this is, of course, very much important from a Spanish point of view. Thank you.
We also agree that as any organism, we should be able, I mean, European Union should be able to go forth and back and to correct some mistakes and reformulate some actions. That's why we should be able to cancel some regulations which are harmful. And as far as negotiations, I think that we should not negotiate Britain's membership in the European Union. We should negotiate future of Europe, because only if we agree on some changes which are necessary for Europe, we may hope that European people would support these changes in referenda in their respective countries, because in a number of member countries, treaty change would require a referendum. I don't think that we may count that on European people to support some changes that would make life easier for Britain at the cost of other countries.
Well, let me start out by saying that the Netherlands shares a lot of a large part of the analysis of the UK, and which you presented in your statement. We do believe that it's just better to leave. Some issues are better left to national parliaments. And to us, there's no value in EU involvement in the kind of milk that children drink in schools, the kind of olive oil that is being served in restaurants. At the same time, though, we have our reservations about some of the solutions you've been suggesting. So let me start out by answering the question that you asked us at the end of your statement regarding the treaty changes. We would be strongly against that, because this will open a Pandora's box. We're going to have to go back to our national parliaments, and there's no way that we can be sure that they will accept it. That, you know, some of the previous speakers already mentioned certain anti-EU sentiments that are prominent on the agenda of certain political parties. In my country, Geert Wilders is an obvious example. So we'd be very hesitant to do that. It may all create all kinds of uncertainties on financial markets. So that's. I mean, I understand that the term has been discredited by recent events in international politics, but this to us is a red line.
Addressing the democratic deficit. Red cards. I gave you 2 letters, UN. I do not think that the European Union would be helped by reinforcing something that is making the UN not being able to act in so many different important areas. However, it would be important to stay clear what the red cards actually, how they are supposed to affect decisions made within the European Union. Having 19 yellow cards, I think, being flagged all around Europe, and the Commission being able to say they matter not at all on the question of the public prosecutor office is not good for the democratic deficit. I'd also comment on Lucio's comment, I think that part of the democratic problems that we see today are not related to an excessive deregulation. It is related to an excessive lack of responsibility and following the regulations that we actually have that are the basis for actually being a member of the European Union. Last, I would just like to say that I think it's important that it is possible to be a strong member of the European Union and the European collaboration without being part fully of the monetary union. And it is important for us to have safeguards in concerns to that question. Thank you.
About the red card, I mean, why did we give the Commission all this power to the Commission? Because we want to have a neutral instance. I mean, we asked the Commission to do a job, and then we must be sure that the Commission will be able to do this job. And here it's about regulation, markets, and of course, 28 countries. Each country has, you know, something that it doesn't like, and if we start with a mechanism like this, there will always be coalitions of countries which, for very special reason, they have lobby groups, interest groups. It might not be for the common good. It might be just for the specific interest of some people that they put the transparent card up. So I'm not sure if we, I mean, then let's go back and look at rather at what we ask the Commission to do. But once we give a mandate to the Commission, we need to give also the tools to the Commission and not always complain about the results. That's one thing, the red card. And then Parliament electing the government. Well, this is a federalization through the back door. And then we have a federal state. Do we want a federal state? Nordic countries, no. Visegrad Group, no. Germany is happy with the status quo, as always. France, maybe, I don't know, but I think that's not, you cannot, this is a kind of coup d'etat, and you cannot just by introducing a technical measure, something like asking the parliament, voting the commission president, you turn a commission, which is a tool of governments, into a government itself. So then this is a revolution. In general, I have a little bit, I come late, so I missed a lot of points, but I have a little bit the impression that everybody's putting up a wish list. And that's what you had, what we did in the past with the EU. Everybody was creating his own EU. Germany has his own EU, France especially, but also newcomers. So they look what they like, they look what they don't like. But this is a building now. And the big question is, do we want to, you know, rebuild, I mean, the whole building, or do we just want to renovate some parts of it, or cut one floor, or whatever? But the German position is that this building is immensely beneficial to all of its members, and I would, you know, recommend caution in moving things around too lightly, because everything is connected with everything, and if we move ahead, we must be extremely cautious not to, because what we do has unintended consequences. Things are moving on other sides of the building, so that's just an initial statement. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I'd just like to comment about the building, because of course the reality is that it's not a building, it's still work in progress. And actually the Eurozone financial crisis has meant that it is very much more still work in progress than it ever was previously. So it's not a static building that someone's trying to now unravel. It's actually an ongoing issue where there are a number of Eurozone member states and a number of non-Eurozone member states. Now those in the Eurozone need, for the existential survival of their currency, to move in a certain direction. So they need to build their house even more. So it's not a building, it's in flux. And the issue is, for those who are not Euro member states, first of all, what do they do as the Eurozone moves, builds a house, a different wing, a garage, a swimming pool, paddocks, a tennis court, over in that direction over there, what do those who aren't participating in that lovely vision do? And then, of course, secondly, I come back to the fact that the EU itself is not competitive. So this house is gradually crumbling. The side that's not to do with building the Eurozone stuff is actually falling down. So we've actually got to rebuild bits of it. So I just take issue with your analogy of it being a static building.
I'm going to be a bit controversial, but I guess this is what the French would say. There's one problem with what you just said. In the end, by treaty, pretty much all member states are bound to join the Eurozone at some point. At some point, I mentioned. Even Denmark and Sweden will probably join at some point again. Then we will end up in a situation where only one country will block everything because it wants safeguards in the internal market, while the Eurozone wants to build its building. As you said, it's not a static building, so it will want to continue building build the building. Then what do we do? Because there will be one country left who will never join the euro, at least not in my lifetime, as many politicians in the UK say. So this is a real question.
Everybody thought flexibility was great, but what does that mean? Red cards seem to be out, but a greater use of a yellow card seemed to be on the table in a variety of ways. A lot of disagreement about what democratic accountability actually meant. Is there a European demos or not? I hate to sound academic, but a lot of people said let's do it at the national level where there is a demos, and a lot of people said no, we have to create one at the European level. Not agreement there. And then lastly, a very interesting point that came out in every presentation about tone. Everybody talked about tone. If the British seem constructive, and if these things are listed, a lot of these points in between, Andrea, you may get. If they believe you're just trying to ruin, nobble, wither away, to use John's phrase, Europe, you will find an awful lot not there. There's a lot of misapprehension about starting to unspool the acquis. Okay, where do you stop? Other people are going to have things. But if it's done in a constructive way, you may get a lot farther. And tone, as we know in the real world for negotiating, really, really matters beyond the policy. And so I think this and TTIP were my two takeaways from this morning. So now let's open to Q&A and try to catch up some of the time we've lost.
Shall we from microphone? I'll just shout.
Is there a microphone?
There's a mic here. I'm happy to shout. Okay.
Jeremy, I think you have to shout.
No,
you just got Economist voice.
Jeremy here from The Economist. I've got a question I'd like to direct at Andrew, but I'd be glad to hear from other members of the panel.
Jeremy, get a mic down.
Does this work? Okay. I'm happy to hear from other representatives as well. And that has to do with the red card. It's clear, Andrea, that there are some supporters for some of the items on Britain's wish list, but it's also clear that there isn't unanimity, and there are differences even among those supporters on some of the details. How do you reconcile that with the demand for a red card? Because surely, as well as enabling Britain to prevent the things it doesn't like, that would make it hard for Britain to get the things it doesn't if there's any disagreement on the part of any other EU member. Thanks.
Okay, so the red card could be a yellow card. I'm calling it a red card to complete the footballing analogy, actually. But if we agreed that it's essential that the Commission shouldn't ignore a yellow card that's legitimately shown by a number of member states, as Ebba just quite rightly pointed out, then what we clearly need is the means to say that national member states must be able to act in the interests of their own countrymen and block future legislation. So let's go back to calling it a yellow card. So now there's absolutely no treaty change. So we forget the colours, okay? It's a neutral card, translucent. and so let's not get hung up on that. The point about it is we need the means to be able to resist future proposals, like, for example, olive oil jugs being banned on the tables of Italian restaurants, which is crazy. I mean, in Britain we probably don't care, but in Italy clearly they would care, and I would if I was in an Italian restaurant in Italy. So very clearly, right, well, precisely. So very clearly what we need to be looking at is the outcome and not be hung up by the method. So if we can agree that there needs to be a means by which national member states, where there are a few, a decent number of them, and that's obviously to be discussed, who really think that olive oil jugs, a European public prosecutor, to give 2 examples, are not something that we want the European Commission to be looking at and getting its hands involved with. There needs to be a means to stop that from happening. And if we can just agree on that as a principle, we don't need to discuss whether that's a treaty change or not. We can simply agree that that needs to happen. But obviously, I want to specifically address this issue of, is Britain cherry picking? And I want to say absolutely not. That's why I very much focused in my opening remarks on this is about making a success of the European project. This is about making Europe count in a world where Europe increasingly isn't counting. So the point I want to make is that to do nothing is simply not an option. Going back to the sort of decline of the Roman Empire, they did nothing. And what happened to the Roman Empire? It destroyed itself with complacency and lack of action. It didn't have to do that. We don't have to do that. What we do have to do is to take measures to ensure that we can solve this issue of democratic legitimacy. And a fundamental point about that is having a permanent means, not just a once-off in moment of time, but a permanent means by which a group of member states can say, this isn't working for us. Now, maybe the Working Time Directive is a bad example because it doesn't resonate with you, but there will be examples of things that each of your countries absolutely loathe and wish we just had never done this. And it ought to be possible to have a means by which a group of member states say, well, we absolutely hate this, we don't want to do this anymore, and a group of other member states say, well, actually, we really like it. Let's take the financial transactions tax, let's address this, elephant in the room. Member states can go ahead under enhanced cooperation and destroy their own financial services industry, and London will gain. That's fantastic. We, on the other hand, don't want to do that. It's the opposite of the oil jugs on restaurant tables. So very importantly is to focus on the outcome we're trying to achieve rather than being hung up on the colours or the terminology.
Of leading European politicians. Can you hear me? How do you see accountability on that level, given that most newspapers operate on the national level and other federal states like Germany and the US have constructed a system of checks and balances within their constitutions, which does not exist in the European Union?
I think one of the reasons there is such a low poll in European Parliament elections, as distinct from national or local elections, is that people feel that they can change the man or woman at the top in a national election, or indeed they can change who's going to be the mayor in a local election, whereas they don't have that sense when they come to vote in a European election. They can't express their frustration by throwing out the person or persons who are running the show, and that reduces the sense of democratic participation. Now, of course, people, by voting in the European Parliament elections, do influence the composition of the Parliament, and in a very indirect and invisible way, that does influence what the European Union does. But for democracy to work in the popular sense, there has to be a visible connection between one's vote and what happens pretty soon afterwards. And that's why I think the idea of electing a president of the Commission by the people, and then the people having an opportunity 5 years later of throwing that person out or reaffirming them in office, will create a European demos. May I just say a word on behalf of the European Commission here about the European Public Prosecutor? We have introduced this to meet the sort of concern that's expressed in Britain about waste of European funds, about fraud affecting your money and how it's being spent in countries where the legal system is not as good as the legal system here is in the UK. We want a European Public Prosecutor to save you money and to ensure that countries who get your money through the European Union spend it wisely. That's all we want the European Prosecutor for. And we don't understand why people are objecting. And I don't understand why Ireland, for example, is one of the parliaments that also objects to the European Public Prosecutor. We all have an interest in ensuring that European money, your money, is not wasted.